The air in his father's house was thick with the cloying scent of lilies and the quiet, self-satisfied murmur of conversations Ethan was not a part of. From his position by the grand stone fireplace, he watched his wife Clara. She stood at the center of the room, a glass of champagne in her hand, her black dress a stark, elegant slash against the cream-colored walls. She was holding court. This was supposed to be a reception following his father's funeral, a somber gathering of friends and family, but for Clara, it was a coronation. She thought her husband, the quiet, artistic son of the great Arthur Sterling, was a footnote in the story of his own father's life. She didn't know that the final chapter had been written for him, by him, long ago. Within 48 hours, the foundation of her world, the very building in which she worked and schemed, would belong to the man she was so publicly ignoring. It's a strange thing, isn't it, to see your own life through someone else's condescending eyes. I hope you've never had to experience that, but if you have, you know the quiet fire it can light inside you. We see stories like this play out in so many ways. Where are you watching from today? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoy seeing patience and integrity win the day, I hope you'll consider liking this video and subscribing for more stories that remind us that true strength is often the strength that goes unseen. Now, let us return to that room, heavy with perfume and ambition, and watch the first cracks begin to form in a very polished facade. Ethan ran a thumb over the cool, familiar metal of the fountain pen in his pocket. It was his father's, a simple, unadorned instrument from a bygone era, yet it had signed contracts that built skylines. Arthur Sterling had been a man of immense presence, a titan of real estate development whose firm, Sterling Holdings, was a monolith of steel and glass. To the world, and especially to Clara and her family, Arthur's son was a profound disappointment. An architect, yes, but one who seemed to possess none of his father's ruthless drive. Ethan designed quaint houses, boutique hotels, small artistic projects that earned him a respectable living, but were laughably insignificant compared to the billion-dollar ventures of his father. Clara had married him, he knew, as an entry point. She was a brilliant and fiercely ambitious senior vice president at Sterling Holdings. Marrying the boss's son seemed like a strategic masterstroke, a way to secure her ascent. She had been dismayed to discover that Ethan had no influence, no interest, and apparently no inheritance of consequence to look forward to. Her affection, always a transactional commodity, had cooled into a polite, weary disdain. "He's taking it well, all things considered," he heard Clara's mother, Eleanor, say in a stage whisper that carried easily across the marble floor. Eleanor was a woman sculpted from disapproval, her face a permanent mask of slight disappointment in the world around her. She glanced at Ethan, her eyes flicking over his simple dark suit as if it were a rental. Clara's brother Mark, a man whose ambition was matched only by his lack of original thought, snorted into his champagne. "Taking it well? He looks like he's waiting for the catering staff to give him instructions." Arthur must have been so frustrated. The word hung in the air. Frustrated. It was the word they always used. Frustrated by his career choice. Frustrated by his quiet nature. Frustrated by his lack of killer instinct. Clara, his wife, gave a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was a performance of sympathy, and she was a consummate actress. "He has his art," she said, the words dripping with condescension. "It's a comfort to him." Dad understood that. He knew Ethan wasn't built for the real world. The real world. The world of hostile takeovers, of leveraging debt, of crushing competitors. The world where Clara believed she was destined to rule. She was next in line for the CEO position now that Arthur was gone. The board loved her. The transition was expected to be seamless. The company, everyone assumed, would be hers in all but name. Ethan felt a familiar, cold weight settle in his gut. It was a feeling he had grown accustomed to over the 5 years of his marriage, a mixture of anger and a strange monastic patience. He had watched them. He had listened. He had cataloged every slight, every dismissive gesture, every condescending remark. He had built a fortress of their insults, and inside that fortress, he had been sharpening his sword. He let his gaze drift from Clara to the large oil painting of his father that hung over the mantel. Arthur Sterling, his eyes alight with a fierce intelligence, seemed to look right at him. They had been closer than anyone knew. Their relationship was not one of public accolades, but of quiet, late-night conversations, of shared blueprints and clandestine site visits. His father had not been frustrated. His father had been plotting. "Clara is a rock," Eleanor continued, placing a manicured hand on her daughter's arm. "She's been holding everything together at the office, and now this. I don't know how you do it, darling. Managing the company's grief and Ethan." The implication was clear. He was a burden, a problem to be managed. Clara's smile tightened. "Someone has to be the adult," she murmured, just loud enough for the circle of admirers around her to hear. She took a delicate sip of her champagne, a celebration. Ethan saw it for what it was. This wasn't a wake, it was a victory lap. Her final obstacle, the towering figure of her founder and father-in-law, was gone. The path was clear. Ethan remained by the fire, a silent ghost at his own father's memorial. He felt the weight of the pen in his pocket, a tangible link to the man they all thought they knew. They saw him as the gentle, ineffective son. They saw his father as a man disappointed in his only child. They saw the future as a straight, ascending line for Clara. They saw a sketch, not the architecture. They saw the blueprint, not the finished, unshakable structure. And they had no idea they were standing in a building he had designed, a building whose foundations were about to be tested. The quiet before the storm was his silence. The rumbling thunder was the truth, still 2 days away, waiting patiently on a piece of paper in a lawyer's office downtown. And the lightning strike would be a single sentence, delivered in a quiet room, that would burn their entire world to the ground. He could wait. He had learned patience from the greatest architect of them all. The foundation of their marriage, like a poorly planned structure, had been built on a lie. Clara's lie to herself. She believed she had married into a dynasty, only to find herself tethered to what she considered its weakest link. The early days of their relationship had been a whirlwind of performative courtship. She had been enchanted by the Sterling name, by the access it granted her. Ethan, a successful architect in his own right, had been intrigued by her fierce intelligence and ambition. He had mistaken her drive for passion, her strategic thinking for genuine connection. The illusion had shattered within the first year. He remembered a dinner early in their marriage at an exclusive restaurant where the tables were spaced far apart for privacy. He had just won a prestigious award for a minimalist lakeside retreat he had designed. He was proud, eager to share the news with her. "That's wonderful, darling," she'd said, her eyes scanning the room for more important people. "A regional prize, you said?" "A national one, actually," he corrected gently. "The Penrose Award." "Oh, lovely." She'd taken a sip of wine, her attention already snagged by a banking CEO holding court 2 tables over. "Arthur is closing the deal on the new waterfront development next week. 45 stories, can you imagine? The scale of it." The comparison was deliberate, a casual dismissal of his achievement. His work was quaint, hers and his father's was monumental. It was the first time he had felt the sting of her condescension so sharply. He had tried to explain the complexities of his design, the challenges of integrating a structure into a delicate ecosystem, the art of creating space that felt both grand and intimate. She had patted his hand. "I'm sure it's very clever, Ethan, but it's not exactly building a legacy, is it? It's drawing pretty houses." The phrase had become her go-to insult, a verbal tick she deployed whenever she felt the need to reassert her superiority. His little drawings, his pretty houses. It was a way of framing his life's work as a hobby, a gentleman's pastime, while her work, shuffling papers and managing teams within a pre-existing empire, was the serious business of the world. Now, at the funeral reception, the memory of that dinner felt like a premonition. Her dismissal had only grown more pronounced with time. As she moved through the crowd, accepting condolences that were really congratulations, she was the picture of a queen surveying her new domain. Ethan watched her stop to speak with several board members of Sterling Holdings. Their heads were bowed together, their expressions a mixture of feigned sadness for Arthur's passing and palpable excitement for the future under Clara's leadership. Mark, her ever-present sycophant of a brother, sidled up to Ethan, his expression oozing false sympathy. "Tough day, huh, buddy? Look, if you need anything, with the estate and all that, I know this stuff can be complicated. Clara and I are happy to guide you." The offer was so transparently insulting, it was almost comical. They assumed he was an imbecile, incapable of managing his own affairs. They pictured a small, token inheritance, a trust fund perhaps, to keep the artistic son comfortable while the adults ran the world. "Thank you, Mark. I think I have it covered," Ethan said, his voice even and calm. He refused to give them the satisfaction of a reaction. His composure was his shield, and it infuriated them. They wanted him to be weak, to be flustered, to need them. His quiet self-sufficiency was a constant, low-grade irritant. Right, of course," Mark said, flustered by the simple rejection. He glanced towards his sister, as if for support. "Well, just know Clara is going to do right by your father's legacy. The company is in the best possible hands. She's a killer. Arthur always said so." She's a killer. It was meant as the highest compliment in their world, and perhaps she was. But a killer was not what his father had wanted to protect his legacy. He had wanted a builder. Ethan's gaze fell upon Mr. Alistair Finch, his father's lawyer for over 40 years, who stood quietly by the doorway. Finch was a man who seemed to be composed entirely of tweed and quiet integrity. He met Ethan's eyes across the crowded room and gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a signal. All is in place. The storm is ready. The knowledge was a bedrock beneath Ethan's feet. While Clara and her family skated on the thin ice of their assumptions, he was standing on solid ground. This gathering was the final scene of their play, the one where they celebrated their triumph. They had no idea the curtain was about to fall, and a new play, one he had written, was about to begin. Clara eventually made her way over to him, her duty as the grieving daughter-in-law finally demanding she acknowledge her husband. She placed a cold hand on his arm. "Are you holding up, darling?" she asked, her voice a perfect imitation of concern. "I'm fine, Clara," he said. "Good. It's been a lot." She gestured vaguely at the crowd. "So many people to thank. The whole company feels like it's adrift. They're all looking to me, you know." It was a statement of power, a reminder of her importance. Even in this moment, ostensibly meant to comfort him, she was reinforcing the dynamic. She was the center. He was the periphery. "They're lucky to have you," Ethan said, the words tasting like ash. He was playing his part, just as she was playing hers. The dramatic irony was a bitter feast. He knew everything, and they knew nothing. "I'll have to be at the office first thing tomorrow. There's 100 things to deal with. The transition," she trailed off, then gave him a look that was a mixture of pity and impatience. "The will reading is on Friday, Finch's office. Don't worry about the details. I'll handle everything." "I'll be there," he said. "Of course," she said, her tone suggesting his presence was a mere formality. "Just try not to be overwhelmed. It's mostly legal jargon. Mark and I can walk you through whatever you end up with afterwards." She squeezed his arm, a gesture of finality, and turned back to her court. The humiliation was complete. In the space of an hour, his wife, her mother, and her brother had collectively dismissed his grief, his intelligence, and his future. They had relegated him to the status of a child, a problem to be managed. He reached into his pocket and closed his hand around the pen. It wasn't just a pen, it was a promise from his father, a promise Ethan was about to keep. The weight of it was no longer cold, it was hot, a burning point of focus in the swirling vortex of their arrogance. The days between the funeral and the will reading were a study in contrasts. For Clara, they were a blur of strategic activity. She was at the Sterling Holdings headquarters from sunrise until long after sunset, her presence a constant, reassuring force for the jittery executives and board members. She convened meetings, issued directives, and spoke eloquently about honoring Arthur Sterling's vision by driving the company forward with relentless momentum. She was, by all accounts, magnificent. She was consolidating her power, ensuring that when the board officially convened to name the new CEO, her appointment would be a foregone conclusion. Her confidence was absolute. She would come home late, smelling of expensive perfume and victory, and find Ethan in his study. The room was his sanctuary, lined with books on architectural theory and the history of design. He would be sketching at his drafting table, the soft scratch of graphite on paper the only sound. "Still at it with your little drawings?" she'd ask, the question a rhetorical jab. She'd loosen her silk blouse, her mind still buzzing with the day's conquests. "We landed the preliminary bid for the city's new convention center today. Arthur was chasing that for years. I closed it." "Congratulations," Ethan would say, his eyes not leaving the page. He was designing a community arts center for a low-income neighborhood, a pro bono project. The complexity of the roof structure, designed to harvest rainwater and maximize natural light, consumed him. To Clara, his focus was an affront. It was as if he were in a different universe, one with different rules and different measures of success. She couldn't comprehend why he wasn't impressed, why he wasn't fawning over her achievements. His quiet detachment felt like a judgment she couldn't bear. "You know, you could show a little interest," she said one evening, her voice sharp. "This is your father's company, the legacy I'm trying to protect." "You seem to be protecting it very well on your own," he replied, his voice maddeningly calm. What she didn't see were the other calls Ethan was making. During the day, when she assumed he was doodling in his study, he was on secure lines with Alistair Finch, going over the intricate details of the Sterling estate. It was a global empire of assets, trusts, and holding companies so complex it would have made a seasoned financier's head spin. But Ethan navigated it with an ease that would have stunned his wife. "The board members are all falling in line behind her, as expected," Finch reported, his voice dry and precise over the phone. "They see her as the continuity candidate. They have no idea about your father's codicil." "Let them," Ethan said. "Their underestimation is our greatest asset. Is the portfolio ready?" "Delivered to my office this morning by secure courier. The projects are, well, impressive would be an understatement, Ethan. Your father would be immensely proud." The portfolio was the secret weapon. For 10 years, Ethan had been running a second architectural firm under a registered, anonymous corporate identity, Aethelred Design Group. Aethelred, the Old English for noble counsel, a private joke between him and his father. While his personal firm handled the small, artistic projects that defined his public persona, Aethelred was a powerhouse. It had designed and consulted on some of the most innovative and profitable skyscrapers, resorts, and urban renewal projects in the world. Several of them, ironically, had been commissioned by competing firms that had won bids against Sterling Holdings. And one of them, the most profitable building in Sterling's entire portfolio, the Solaris Tower, had been designed by Aethelred as an external consultant. Arthur was the only one who knew. It was Arthur's master plan. He had seen his son's genius not as a weakness, but as a different kind of strength. He didn't want a killer to succeed him. He wanted a creator, a visionary. He knew the sharks on his board would never accept Ethan outright, so he had encouraged Ethan to build his own empire in secret, to create a resume so undeniable that when the time came, his ascension would be not just an inheritance, but a meritocracy. "Everything is in order then," Ethan said to Finch. "The stage is set," the lawyer confirmed. "Just be prepared, son. When the truth comes out, it will be explosive." Ethan hung up the phone and looked at the plans on his desk. The Community Arts Center, a project with no profit, no glory, just a space for people to create. He had poured his heart into it. It was the kind of work Clara despised as a waste of his talent. But to Ethan, it was the entire point. Building things that mattered, not just things that paid. His father had understood that. Near the end, Arthur had grown weary of the corporate battles. "Build something beautiful, son," he had told Ethan one night, looking over the Ethelred portfolio. "The money will follow, but build something that will outlast the money." That evening, Clara came home in a state of agitated triumph. "I had dinner with the board chairman," she announced, throwing her keys onto the hall table with a clatter. "It's done. The vote is just a formality. The announcement will be Monday." She looked at him, expecting, what? Congratulations? Awe? "That's fast," Ethan commented, turning a page in his book. Her face hardened. "It's what's best for the company. We need to project strength and stability, not a power vacuum." She walked over to him, her shadow falling across his book. "Which brings me to Friday, the will reading. I spoke to Finch. It seems your father set up a rather generous trust for you. It should be more than enough for you to continue with your hobbies for the rest of your life." The condescension was a physical force. She was offering him a gilded cage, a lifetime allowance to keep him out of her way. "You spoke to Finch about the contents of the will?" Ethan asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Of course," she said, oblivious. "As the incoming CEO, I need to be aware of any major disbursements from the estate that might affect the company's stock. It's just due diligence." She had tried to pry, but Finch was a vault. Ethan knew the old lawyer would have given her nothing but polite, legalistic deflections. Her confidence stemmed from her own arrogance, not from any actual information. "So you'll be taken care of," she finished, as if closing a business deal. "You won't have to worry about a thing." "No," Ethan said, closing his book and standing up. He looked her directly in the eye. "I won't." The simple, declarative statement, devoid of its expected gratitude, seemed to unnerve her for a fraction of a second. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, a momentary glitch in her perfect composure. But it was gone as quickly as it came, dismissed as another one of her husband's oddities. "Good," she said, turning away. "I'm going to have a bath. It's been a long day of running your father's empire." Your father's empire. The words echoed in the silent room. Not our empire, not the family's, hers. She had already claimed it. She just had to wait for the paperwork to catch up. 2 more days. The night before the will reading was thick with a palpable, unspoken tension. Clara had invited her mother and brother for dinner. It was meant to be a quiet family meal, a final moment of solidarity before her official ascent. For Ethan, it was the final gauntlet of their disdain, the last chapter in his long and meticulously documented list of grievances. They sat in the formal dining room, a space Ethan had always found cold and impersonal. It was Clara's domain, decorated in shades of gray and silver, with sharp angles and metallic accents. It felt less like a home and more like a corporate boardroom. Eleanor, as always, led the charge. "I must say, Clara, the way you've handled yourself this past week has been remarkable. A true leader. Your father would have been so proud." She said your father, as if her own late husband had been a titan of industry and not a mid-level accountant who had quietly passed away a decade prior. "Arthur would have been proud too," Mark chimed in, raising his wineglass. He knew Clara was the only one who had the guts to fill his shoes. To Clara, Eleanor echoed. They drank, their eyes shining with reflected glory. Ethan did not raise his glass. He simply watched them, his expression unreadable. His silence was a vacuum into which they poured their assumptions. "Oh, don't be morose, Ethan," Eleanor chided gently, as if speaking to a sullen teenager. "We're celebrating Clara's strength. It's what your father would want, not all this gloom." "My father just died, Eleanor," Ethan said, his voice flat. "I think a little gloom is appropriate." The directness of the statement startled them. They were accustomed to his passive silence, not direct contradiction. Clara shot him a warning look. "Mother, he's just being sensitive. It's been hard on him." She framed his grief as an emotional failing, a fragility she had to manage. Of course, dear," Eleanor said, though her expression soured. Mark, ever the tactician, decided to change the subject to one he found more interesting: money. "So, tomorrow's the big day, the reading of the scrolls. Any idea what dear old Dad left for the B team?" He grinned at Ethan, the insult delivered with a fraternal slap on the back that never came. "Mark, be nice," Clara said, though there was a smile playing on her lips. "As I was telling Ethan, he will be very well taken care of. A trust fund. He won't ever have to worry about the practicalities of life." "A trust fund," Mark mused, swirling his wine. "Smart, very smart, keeps the capital from being frittered away on passion projects." He looked at Ethan. "No offense, buddy, but you're an artist, not a businessman. Your dad knew that. This way you can just focus on what is it you call them? Your designs." "My little drawings," Ethan supplied, his voice devoid of emotion. Clara flinched. Hearing the insult repeated back to her in his deadpan tone was unexpectedly jarring. For a moment, she looked uncomfortable. "Well, yes," Mark said, laughing, oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. "Exactly. You can draw your little heart out, and Clara will be busy making sure the family name actually means something in the 21st century. It's a perfect arrangement, really. Everyone plays to their strengths." "And what do you imagine my strengths are, Mark?" Ethan asked, leaning forward slightly. He picked up his water glass, his movements slow and deliberate. Mark was taken aback by the direct question. "Well, you're creative, good with aesthetics." He was floundering, realizing he had never given the subject a moment's thought beyond his initial dismissive assessment. "He designed this house," Clara interjected, a hint of pride in her voice. It was the one aspect of his work she occasionally touted, as it reflected well on her. "Did he now?" Eleanor said, looking around the room as if for the first time. "Well, it's very modern." In her vocabulary, modern was not a compliment. It meant cold, lacking the traditional grandeur she associated with wealth. "The original structure was a mess," Ethan stated simply. "The load-bearing walls were improperly supported. The foundation had water damage. I redesigned it from the ground up to be structurally sound. The aesthetics, as you call them, were a secondary consideration." His tone was that of a lecturer, calm and factual. It was so out of character that it silenced them. They saw him as a dreamer, an artist. They did not associate him with talk of foundations and load-bearing walls. That was the language of his father, of the real world. "My point is," Mark finally recovered, eager to get back on familiar ground, "that you're lucky. You're being handed a life of leisure. Most people would kill for that. No responsibilities, no pressure." "You think having no responsibility is a gift?" Ethan asked. The question was soft, but it landed with incredible weight. "Of course it is," Mark scoffed. "It's the dream." "No," Ethan said, placing his glass down with a quiet click. "It's a cage." The table fell silent. The metaphor was too stark, too architectural for them to ignore. They looked at him, truly looked at him, perhaps for the first time that evening. They saw not a sad, grieving son, but a man made of something harder than they had ever imagined. The quiet observer in the corner had suddenly spoken, and his words did not fit their narrative. Clara, a master of controlling social dynamics, quickly moved to diffuse the situation. "Ethan, you're being overly dramatic. We're all just saying that we're going to take care of you. that's all." "I know what you're saying," he replied, his gaze sweeping over the three of them. His wife, her mother, her brother. "You've been saying it for 5 years. I've heard you." The finality in his voice was chilling. It wasn't an accusation. It was a statement of fact, a confirmation of receipt. He had received their messages, their judgments, their condescension, and he had filed them all away. The rest of the dinner was a strained, awkward affair. The easy confidence they had felt at the beginning of the meal had evaporated, replaced by a strange unease. They had prodded the quiet animal in the corner, and for the first time, it had looked back at them with intelligent, watchful eyes. They didn't understand what they were seeing, but it made them nervous. As Eleanor and Mark left, they gave Ethan wide berth, their goodbyes to him noticeably more subdued. Left alone with his wife, the silence in the dining room was immense. "What was that about?" Clara demanded, her voice low and furious. "Were you trying to embarrass me in front of my family?" "I was having a conversation," Ethan said, standing to clear his plate. "No, you were being difficult. You were being strange. It's a cage? What is wrong with you? Your father is gone, and you're quoting bad poetry. My family is trying to be supportive, and you're throwing it back in their faces." He stopped and turned to her. "Supportive? Clara, they were planning how to spend my inheritance and congratulating you on taking over a company that isn't yours yet. That isn't support. It's opportunism." "It is mine," she hissed, her composure finally cracking. "Everyone knows it. The only person who seems to be in denial is you." "We'll see," he said, and the two words were a promise and a threat. He walked out of the room, leaving her standing alone amidst the ruins of her celebratory dinner. She stood frozen, a sudden, unfamiliar chill tracing its way down her spine. For the first time, she felt a sliver of doubt. It was a terrifying, alien feeling. The world, which had seemed so certain just a few hours ago, now felt tilted, unstable, as if standing on a foundation with water damage. The morning of the will reading dawned gray and overcast, the sky the color of slate. It was a perfect backdrop for the drama about to unfold. Ethan dressed meticulously in a dark charcoal suit, the fabric impeccable, the cut sharp. It was a suit he had designed himself, a subtle expression of his belief that form and function should be one. To Clara, it was just another suit. She herself was dressed in a navy blue power dress, her armor for the corporate world. Her confidence from the night before had returned, fortified by a night of restless sleep and a morning of reassuring herself that Ethan's odd behavior was simply a manifestation of grief. They drove to the lawyer's office in silence. The offices of Finch, Abernathy, and Coyle occupied the top 2 floors of a pre-war building downtown, a bastion of old money and quiet power. The lobby was hushed, paneled in dark mahogany, and smelled of lemon oil and old paper. Alistair Finch's personal office was a corner suite with panoramic views of the city, a city Arthur Sterling had helped to build. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, not just law books, but histories, biographies, and volumes on architecture. It was a scholar's room, not a shark's. Mark and Eleanor were already there, seated on a leather sofa. They looked uncomfortable, out of their depth. They were players in a game whose rules they didn't fully understand, present only as Clara's entourage. They nodded stiffly at Ethan. Clara, however, was in her element. She greeted Finch with a warm, professional smile. "Alistair, thank you for arranging this so promptly." "It was Arthur's specific instruction," Finch said, his expression neutral. He gestured for them to sit. Ethan and Clara took the 2 chairs opposite his large mahogany desk. The desk itself was clear, save for a leather-bound folio and a single familiar object. His father's fountain pen, which Finch had apparently retrieved for the occasion. Ethan looked at it, then at Finch. The lawyer gave him a look of quiet encouragement. The room settled into a tense silence. This was the quiet before the storm. The air itself seemed to crackle with anticipation. Clara sat perfectly poised, her hands folded in her lap, the picture of calm authority. She believed this was a formality, the final administrative hurdle before her reign began. Eleanor and Mark fidgeted, their eyes darting around the opulent room. Ethan was a statue of stillness. His internal world, however, was a symphony of observation. He noted the slight tremor in Mark's hand as he reached for a glass of water. He saw the way Eleanor's gaze kept flicking to the door, as if expecting some other, more important person to arrive. He saw the faint lines of tension around Clara's mouth, the only betrayal of the stress she was under. She was an actress giving the performance of a lifetime, and she had no idea the audience already knew the ending. Finch put on a pair of half-moon glasses and opened the folio. "We are gathered here today to read the last will and testament of Arthur Sterling," he began, his voice a calm, steady baritone that filled the room. "I will dispense with the usual legal preamble, as per Arthur's request. He was never a man for verbosity." A faint smile touched Finch's lips. He wanted this to be clear, direct, and final. Clara gave a small, concurring nod. "Get on with it," her posture seemed to say. "First," Finch continued, "there are several bequests to long-serving employees of Sterling Holdings, various charities, and distant relatives. These have been handled by my office already and do not require enumeration here." He paused, letting the weight of the moment build. "We now come to the primary disposition of the estate." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. Mark stopped fidgeting. Clara's expression remained unchanged, but Ethan could see her knuckles were white where she gripped the arms of her chair. "To my son-in-law, Mark Connolly," Finch read, and Mark sat up straighter, a look of surprise and greed flashing across his face. "I leave the sum of $100,000 with a sincere hope that he will use it to develop a sense of personal ambition rather than borrowing the ambitions of others." The air went out of Mark like a punctured balloon. The bequest was generous, but the attached sentiment was a stunning, posthumous slap in the face. His face flushed a deep, mottled red. Eleanor gasped. Clara shot a furious glare at Finch, as if he were the author of the insult, not the reader. Finch continued, his voice unwavering. "To my son's mother-in-law, Eleanor Vance, I also leave the sum of $100,000. In gratitude for demonstrating to my son the profound difference between perceived status and actual worth." Eleanor looked as if she had been struck. The money was an insult, a token wrapped in a devastating critique of her entire worldview. The room was thick with their humiliation. This was the moral mirror, polished to a perfect shine by his father, forcing them to see themselves as he had seen them. Ethan felt a grim satisfaction. His father had seen it all. He had missed nothing. Finch turned a page. "Now to the matter of my wife, Clara Sterling." Clara's back went ramrod straight. This was it, the main event. She visibly composed herself, ready to receive her kingdom. "To my daughter-in-law, Clara Sterling," Finch read, his voice taking on a graver tone. "A woman of immense talent, drive, and ambition. I have watched her career at my company with great interest. She has been an asset to Sterling Holdings. In recognition of her service, and as a wedding gift that I was remiss in not providing sooner, I leave her my entire collection of vintage automobiles and the property in the south of France." Clara's perfectly constructed mask of composure began to crack. Cars? A vacation home? It was a fortune to be sure, but it was a consolation prize. It was the gift for a valued employee, not an heir. A wave of confusion and panic washed over her face. She looked from Finch to Ethan, her eyes wide with disbelief. That's it?" she stammered, the words escaping before she could stop them. "That is your personal inheritance, yes," Finch said calmly. "But the company, the estate, the rest of it?" Her voice was rising, a note of hysteria creeping in. Finch looked at her over the top of his glasses. "Arthur was very specific about the division of his assets. The cars and the villa are yours, free and clear. The remainder of the estate," he paused, turning the final page of the will. The sound of the thick paper was like a gunshot in the silent room. He looked directly at Ethan. "The remainder of my personal property, my liquid assets, my art collection, my real estate holdings, including the primary residences in New York, London, and Zurich, and my entire controlling stake of 51% of the shares in Sterling Holdings, I leave in Yaic entirety to the only person I trust to understand what I have built and why I built it." Finch's voice was clear and strong, each word a hammer blow to Clara's world. "I leave everything to my beloved son, Ethan Sterling." The statement landed, simple, devastating, final. For a full 10 seconds, the only sound in the room was the frantic, ragged breathing of Clara. The color had drained from her face, leaving behind a waxy, translucent mask of shock. Her mind, usually so quick and strategic, was short-circuiting, unable to process the information. It was a logical impossibility, a tear in the fabric of the reality she had so carefully constructed. Mark and Eleanor were frozen, their own petty humiliations forgotten in the face of this cataclysm. They stared at Ethan, their expressions a comical mixture of horror and confusion. They were looking at the same man who had sat silently at their dinner table the night before, the same quiet, artistic disappointment. But the context had irrevocably shifted. The frame around the picture had changed, and now they saw not a harmless sketch, but a portrait of immense, terrifying power. Ethan did not look at them. He kept his eyes on Alistair Finch, his expression calm. He had known this was coming, had prepared for this moment for years, but the reality of it was still profound. The weight of his father's trust settled onto his shoulders, a heavy but welcome mantle. Clara finally found her voice. It was a strangled whisper. "No." She shook her head, a small, jerky movement. "No, that can't be right. There's a mistake, a later version. Arthur, he wanted me to lead the company. He told me. He said I had the killer instinct." "He did say that," Finch acknowledged, his voice gentle but firm. "He also said that a killer can only tear things down. He wanted a builder to succeed him." Finch removed his glasses and looked directly at Clara. "There is no mistake, Clara. This is the final, notarized, and witnessed will of Arthur Sterling. It is ironclad." The lawyer's words were the nails in the coffin of her ambition. The reality began to sink in, not as a wave, but as a slow, crushing pressure. Ethan, her husband, the man she had dismissed and belittled, now owned everything. The company she had dedicated her life to, the position she had schemed and fought for, the very foundation of her identity, it all belonged to him. Her shock began to curdle into rage. "This is his doing," she spat, pointing a trembling finger at Ethan. "He manipulated him. He must have. In the end, when he was sick, he poisoned him against me." The accusation was wild, desperate. It was the lashing out of a cornered animal. Ethan finally turned his head and looked at his wife. His gaze was not angry or triumphant. It was cold, analytical, and filled with a profound, weary sadness. "He wasn't sick until the very end, Clara," he said, his voice as quiet and steady as it had been the night before. "And he and I were having these conversations for the last 10 years. He wasn't poisoned. He just saw things clearly." His calm response was more devastating than any shout could have been. It robbed her of her outrage, leaving her with nothing but the stark, unpalatable truth. This wasn't a last-minute betrayal. It was a long-term plan, a decade in the making, executed right under her nose. Her blindness, her arrogance had been absolute. But Finch wasn't finished. There was one final, exquisitely crafted blow left to deliver. "There is one more clause," he said, drawing their attention back to the document. "It is not a legally binding directive, but a formal recommendation to the board of directors of Sterling Holdings. Arthur framed it as his final piece of advice as founder and majority shareholder. He cleared his throat and read, "The board will no doubt be considering a new chief executive officer to guide the company. Many will assume the best path is continuity to promote from within. But continuity is not what Sterling Holdings needs. It needs vision. It needs a return to the principles of innovative design and structural integrity that made its name. Therefore, I strongly, and with the full weight of my legacy, recommend that the board appoint the new majority shareholder, my son, Ethan Sterling, as the next chairman and CEO, effective immediately." Finch looked up. "And as the executor of Arthur's estate, my first action was to call an emergency board meeting for this morning. They have been waiting for my call. The vote, given the new ownership structure, was a formality. As of 10 minutes ago, the board has unanimously voted to accept Arthur's recommendation." He looked at Ethan. "Congratulations, Mr. Sterling. You are the new CEO of Sterling Holdings." Then he turned his gaze to Clara, whose face had now gone beyond pale to a ghastly, mottled gray. Her mouth was open, but no sound came out. The carefully constructed world of her ambition, her entire future, had been dismantled and swept away in the space of 5 minutes. Finch delivered the final, quiet sentence, the one that broke her completely. "Which means, Clara," he said, his voice softened with something that might have been pity, "that your position as senior vice president now reports directly to him. Your job, your future at the company, is in your husband's hands." The room was utterly silent. The only movement was the slow, methodical way Ethan reached across the desk, picked up his father's fountain pen, and slid it into the breast pocket of his jacket. It was a gesture of quiet, absolute ownership. He had not just inherited a company, he had claimed his birthright. Clara froze. It wasn't a figure of speech, it was a physical reality. Her body, which had been vibrating with shock and rage, became utterly still. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin the color of ash. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, were fixed on Ethan. It was the look of an animal that has just heard the click of a trap it never knew was there. The new CEO of Sterling Holdings. Her boss. The words echoed in the cavernous silence of her mind, refusing to compute. This was Ethan. Ethan who read books on philosophy. Ethan who spent weekends building furniture in his workshop. Ethan who she had to remind to RSVP to social events. The man she considered a charming, handsome, but ultimately ineffectual accessory to her own brilliant career. That man was now the most powerful figure in her professional life. The man who could fire her with a single sentence. Her mind, a machine of calculation and strategy, frantically tried to find an angle, a leverage point, a way out. There was none. The will was ironclad. The board had already voted. The power structure had been inverted with the brutal finality of a guillotine. She, who had been at the apex of power just moments before, was now at the absolute bottom, dependent on the mercy of the man she had shown none. Mark was the first to break the spell. His sycophantic instincts, honed over a lifetime of latching onto power, were faster than his pride. His face, which had been a mask of sullen anger, morphed into a grotesque semblance of a smile. "Ethan, man, CEO," he stammered, standing up. Wow. We had no idea. You kept that quiet. That's incredible. Congratulations." He took a step towards Ethan, his hand outstretched, a desperate, fawning gesture. Ethan didn't even look at him. His eyes were still on his wife. He was watching her process the new reality, the collapse of her world. He was giving her the space to experience the full impact of her own arrogance. "Sit down, Mark," Ethan said, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable edge of command. Mark froze, his hands still outstretched, and then slowly, awkwardly, sat back down, his face burning with a fresh wave of humiliation. Eleanor was simply staring, her mouth slightly agape. The insults from the will, the money, all of it was forgotten. She was looking at her son-in-law, the man she had pitied and disdained, and seeing the ghost of Arthur Sterling. The same quiet authority, the same unnerving stillness. She had made a terrible, terrible miscalculation. Clara's stillness finally broke. A single, shuddering breath escaped her lips. Her mind rebooted, shifting from shock to a new, desperate strategy: damage control. The rage was still there, a white-hot coal in her chest, but she smothered it with the cold ash of pragmatism. She was a survivor. She had to salvage this. She stood up, her movements stiff, robotic. She smoothed down her dress, a subconscious attempt to regain some semblance of her former poise. "Ethan," she began, her voice hoarse, unrecognizable. She tried to inject warmth into it, but it came out as a strained, brittle plea. "We need to talk. In private." Ethan finally turned his full attention to her. He looked at her not as a husband, but as a CEO assessing a subordinate. "There's nothing to talk about in private, Clara," he said, his voice level. "Everything from this point forward is a matter of business. And right now, we are in a meeting with the company's legal counsel." He gestured to Finch. The distinction was brutal. He was drawing a line, not in the sand, but in solid granite. The personal was over. This was professional. "Business?" she repeated, her voice trembling. "Ethan, I am your wife." "And I," he replied, his voice dropping even lower, becoming even quieter, "am your new boss. You, your mother, and your brother have spent the last 5 years making it abundantly clear that our marriage is a business arrangement. You married the Sterling name, hoping for a position. Congratulations, you have one." The quiet cruelty of the statement was breathtaking. He was using their own transactional view of the world against them, holding up the moral mirror one last time. Tears welled in Clara's eyes. They might have been tears of genuine remorse, of fear, or simply of frustrated rage. It was impossible to tell. "Please," she whispered, "don't do this here." "Do what, Clara?" he asked, the question a genuine inquiry. "I haven't done anything yet. I've simply inherited the role my father prepared me for, the same way you were preparing to inherit it." He paused. "The only difference is, I earned it." That was the blow she couldn't deflect. I earned it. Finch, sensing the meeting had reached its conclusion, began to gather his papers. "Well," he said into the tense silence, "my work here is done. The transfer of assets will begin immediately. Ethan, the office of the chairman is, of course, ready for you. Your father's assistant, Margaret, is waiting for your call. She has been briefed." He stood up. "Clara, Eleanor, Mark, thank you for coming." It was a clear dismissal. Eleanor and Mark scrambled to their feet, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere of the room. They mumbled their goodbyes and practically fled, not even looking at Clara. They were rats deserting a sinking ship. Clara remained standing, rooted to the spot, her eyes locked on Ethan. The tears were now streaming freely down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. The queen was dethroned, her armor stripped away, leaving her exposed and vulnerable. "Ethan," she pleaded, her voice breaking, "what are you going to do?" It was the question that had been screaming in her mind since the moment of the revelation. What was her fate? Ethan stood up, buttoning his suit jacket. He was no longer just her husband. He was an imposing figure of authority, his calm demeanor more intimidating than any display of anger could ever be. He walked around the desk and stopped in front of her. He was close enough to touch, but he made no move to comfort her. He looked down at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke, his voice quiet, precise, and utterly final. "We will discuss your future at Sterling Holdings on Monday morning," he said. "My office, 9 a.m. sharp." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Be on time." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving her alone with the ghost of her ambitions and the terrifying uncertainty of her future. The quiet command, "Be on time," was the ultimate expression of his new power. It was the instruction of a superior to a subordinate. The power dynamic had not just been inverted, it had been shattered and remade in his image. She was no longer a partner or even a wife. She was an employee, and she had just been summoned to the principal's office. The 48 hours that followed were the longest of Clara's life. The drive home from the lawyer's office was a silent, suffocating ordeal. Ethan drove, his hands steady on the wheel, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. He did not speak, did not look at her. He was a stranger, a powerful, unknowable entity sitting beside her. Clara sat in the passenger seat, her body rigid, her mind a maelstrom of panic and disbelief. The world had been turned upside down, and she was in free fall. When they arrived back at the house, his house, she now realized with a fresh jolt of horror, he went straight to his study and closed the door. The quiet click of the latch was like a vault ceiling. She was locked out, not just from the room, but from his life, from the center of power. She spent the rest of the day in a daze, wandering through the large, minimalist rooms that suddenly felt alien and menacing. Every object, every piece of furniture was a testament to his taste, his control. He owned it all. He owned her. The thought was a violation. Her phone buzzed incessantly. Texts and missed calls from her mother, her brother, board members, colleagues. The news was spreading like wildfire through the city's elite. Ethan Sterling, the reclusive artist's son, is the new king. Her own phone, which had been a symbol of her power and connectivity, was now a source of dread. What could she say? How could she explain her own monumental, public failure? She tried to formulate a plan. Apologize, plead, seduce, threaten. Every scenario she ran through her mind ended with the same cold, quiet face of her husband. She had no leverage. Her ambition, her intelligence, her killer instinct, they were all useless now. Her only currency was mercy, and she had a horrible feeling she had spent the last 5 years bankrupting her account. That evening, she knocked on his study door. There was no answer. She knocked again, louder. "Ethan, please, we have to talk." After a long moment, the door opened. He stood there, not angry, but weary. He had taken off his jacket and tie, his sleeves rolled up to his forearms. He looked like the man she had married, but his eyes were different. They held the weight of an empire. "There's nothing to say that can't wait until Monday, Clara," he said. "I am your wife," she cried, the words a desperate assertion of a status she was no longer sure she held. "You can't just shut me out. You owe me an explanation." A flicker of something, annoyance, pity, crossed his face. "Owe you? I owe you nothing. You were the one who built this wall between us, brick by brick, with every condescending word, every dismissive glance. You just never realized you were walling yourself in, not me out." The architectural metaphor was deliberate, a final twist of the knife. I didn't know," she stammered, the excuse sounding feeble, even to her own ears. "No," he agreed, his voice soft. "You didn't. You never bothered to look. You saw what you wanted to see, a stepping stone. You underestimated me. You underestimated my father. You underestimated our relationship. That is not my failure, Clara. It is yours." He was giving her the list of grievances, not in anger, but as a clinical diagnosis of her failure. "What I did, the way I acted," she began, trying to formulate an apology. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I was blinded by ambition." "You were blinded by arrogance," he corrected her, his voice cutting. "Ambition is a fire that drives you. Arrogance is a fire that consumes you. You thought the world revolved around your plans, your career. You thought my father's legacy was a prize to be won, not a responsibility to be carried. You were so busy looking up at the throne, you never saw the man who was already sitting in it." The truth of his words was suffocating. She had been so focused on the destination that she had been utterly blind to the journey he had been on. "Please, Ethan," she whispered, the last of her pride crumbling. "What will happen on Monday? Just tell me, am I fired?" He looked at her for a long time, his face a mask of stone. He seemed to be weighing her, judging her. The silence stretched on, each second a fresh turn of the screw. "I haven't decided," he said finally. The uncertainty was a calculated cruelty, a way of making her live with the consequences of her actions. "As I said, it's a business decision, and I will make it based on what is best for Sterling Holdings." He started to close the door. "Wait," she said, a new wave of desperation washing over her. "I can be an asset. I know the company inside and out. I closed the convention center deal. I can help you." He paused, his hand on the doorknob. "Can you?" he asked, a genuine question in his voice. "Can you work for me, Clara? Can you take direction from the man you called a hobbyist? Can you accept that his little drawings are the reason this company has a future? Because if you can't, then you are not an asset. You are a liability, and I don't tolerate liabilities." He closed the door, leaving her standing in the hallway, the echo of his words a death knell to their past. The choice he had laid out for her was impossible. To stay would be a daily, public humiliation. To leave would be to admit utter defeat. He had not just taken her future, he had trapped her in a prison of her own making. The weekend was a wasteland. She didn't see him again. He remained in his study or in other parts of the house, a ghost in his own home. On Sunday afternoon, she received a call from her brother Mark. His voice was oily, fawning. "Clara, how are you holding up?" he asked. "How do you think I'm holding up, Mark?" she snapped. Right, stupid question. "Listen, I was thinking, maybe you and I could talk to Ethan. You know, smooth things over. I think that crack about my ambition in the will, I think it was just Arthur's weird sense of humor, you know? I'm ready to get serious. I could be a real asset to Ethan, to the company." Clara hung up. The pathetic, transparent opportunism of her own family was the final, bitter pill. They had abandoned her and were now scrambling to get close to the new source of power. She was utterly, completely alone. Monday morning arrived like a death sentence. She dressed with the care of a soldier preparing for a battle she knew she would lose. She chose a simple, conservative gray dress. No power suits, no bold colors. It was the attire of the vanquished. She drove to the office alone. Walking through the lobby of Sterling Holdings, the company she had once thought of as her own, was an exercise in humiliation. The security guards, the receptionists, the junior executives, they all looked at her with a mixture of pity and morbid curiosity. She was yesterday's news, the fallen queen. When she reached the executive floor, the change was palpable. The atmosphere, which had been tense and anxious since Arthur's death, was now humming with a strange, quiet energy. It was the energy of a new regime. Her old office, the spacious corner suite of the senior VP, felt like a museum of a life she used to live. Her desk was clear, her computer off. She didn't belong here anymore. At precisely 8:59 a.m., she walked to the end of the hall, to the massive double doors of the chairman's office, her father-in-law's office, her husband's office. She took a deep, shuddering breath and knocked. "Come in." The voice was calm, controlled. She pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office was transformed. Arthur Sterling's heavy, ornate furniture was gone. The dark, brooding oil paintings had been replaced. The room was now bright, airy, and minimalist. In place of the massive mahogany desk was a sleek, modern drafting table, covered in blueprints and architectural models. Large, framed photographs of breathtakingly innovative buildings adorned the walls. It was no longer a king's throne room. It was a creator's workshop. Ethan was not sitting behind a desk. He stood by the vast, floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. He turned as she entered. He was wearing a simple, open-collared shirt and dark trousers. He looked relaxed, comfortable, and completely in command. "Clara," he said, his voice neutral, "thank you for being on time." The formality was another assertion of his power. "Ethan," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "This office, it needed more light," he said simply. He gestured to one of the chairs he had placed in the center of the room. "Please, sit." She sat, feeling like a nervous applicant at a job interview. He remained standing, a subtle but effective way to maintain the power imbalance. "I've spent the weekend reviewing the state of the company," he began, his tone all business. "Personnel files, active projects, financial outlooks. I've read your file, Clara. It's very impressive. Your performance reviews are stellar. Your project completion rate is the highest in the company." She felt a flicker of hope. He was acknowledging her value. "You are, without a doubt, a brilliant operational manager," he continued. "You are excellent at executing a vision. You are organized, ruthless, and effective." He paused, walking over to the drafting table. He picked up a thick, leather-bound portfolio. "But you are not a visionary," he said, his voice hardening slightly. "You don't build, you manage. You don't create, you capitalize. For 5 years, my father's biggest concern was that Sterling Holdings had stopped innovating. It had become a bank that happened to construct buildings, not an architectural firm that understood finance. It was profitable, but its soul was dying." He placed the portfolio on the low table in front of her. "Open it." Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She opened the cover. The first page was a title plate, "Ethelred Design Group, Selected Works." She turned the page. It was a stunning photograph of the Solaris Tower, the most iconic and profitable building in the Sterling portfolio, a twisting silver masterpiece that had won dozens of international awards. Underneath the photo were the design credits. Lead architect, Ethan Sterling. She gasped, her mind reeling. She turned the page again. Another landmark building, one built by their biggest competitor in Dubai. A building Clara had openly envied, had used as an example of where Sterling Holdings was falling behind. Lead architect, Ethan Sterling. Page after page, a secret history of the last decade's most celebrated architectural achievements. Buildings she had studied, admired, and coveted. All of them his. The scale of his secret life, his secret genius, was staggering. It was an empire of creativity he had built in the shadows, while she had been mocking his little drawings. The portfolio was the final crushing blow. It recontextualized everything. He hadn't just inherited the company, he was, and had been for years, its most qualified leader. His ascension wasn't nepotism, it was an overdue course correction. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a new, profound understanding. The humiliation she felt was no longer just about losing power. It was the deeper, more painful humiliation of a fool who has finally been shown the truth. "You," she whispered, "all this time." "My father believed that respect had to be earned," he said. "He knew the board would never accept me based on my name alone. So he and I made a plan. I would build a portfolio, a body of work so undeniable that no one could question my credentials when the time came. Ethelred was my father's idea, his final project." He looked at her, and for the first time she saw a flicker of the man she had once loved, a sadness in his eyes. "I wanted to tell you, Clara, so many times, but every time I tried, you made it clear you had no respect for what I did. You would have seen it as a hobby, no matter the scale. You had to see this," he gestured to the portfolio, "to understand." She closed the portfolio, her hands shaking. "What do you want from me, Ethan?" she asked, her voice broken. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze once again turning to the city skyline outside his window. The city he was now tasked with shaping. "I'm not going to fire you, Clara," he said, and she felt a wave of dizzying relief. "As I said, you are a brilliant operational manager. I need a good COO, someone to run the day-to-day business, to execute the vision. The job is yours, if you want it. The offer hung in the air. It was a lifeline, but one with a heavy price. Chief Operating Officer. A step up in title from Senior VP, but a universe away from the CEO position she had craved. She would be his second in command, permanently in his shadow, tasked with executing his vision. It was a gilded cage, a position of immense responsibility, but no ultimate authority. But, he continued, turning back to face her, his expression now hard, uncompromising, there are conditions. You will report to me. You will follow my directives. You will embrace a new philosophy for this company, one based on design innovation, sustainability, and community impact, not just profit margins. And you will learn some humility. Your salary will be cut by 30%, effective today. The difference will be used to fund the new pro bono community projects division I am establishing. You will earn it back when you prove you understand what it means to build something for people, not just for a balance sheet. He let the terms sink in. It was a complete re-education, a demotion in status and salary, wrapped in the guise of a promotion. It was poetic justice, crafted with the precision of an architect. And your family, he added, his voice like ice. Your mother and your brother are no longer welcome at any company events. Their financial well-being is now their own concern. This company is not a family sinecure. Is that clear? She could only nod, the words trapped in her throat. So, he said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly, that is the offer. You can be a part of the future of Sterling Holdings, or you can walk away. The choice is yours. You have until the end of the day to decide. He walked back to his drafting table, picked up a pen, and bent over a set of blueprints, his attention already elsewhere. The meeting was over. He had laid out the new architecture of their relationship, of her life. She was a component, a functional part of his larger design, but she was no longer the architect. She stood up on shaky legs, the heavy portfolio still in her lap. She looked at him, the man she had lived with for 5 years and never known. He was a stranger, a giant who had been living quietly in her house all along. She had a choice, to flee in disgrace or to stay and submit, to learn from the man she had so thoroughly misjudged. It was the most difficult and most important decision of her life. The queen was dead. The question was whether she could learn to be a citizen in the new republic. The days that followed were a quiet revolution. Clara accepted the position. To walk away would have been to admit complete and utter defeat, a public declaration of her own irrelevance. Staying was an act of survival, a bitter pill swallowed in the hope of a future, however diminished. She moved into the COO's office, a smaller suite adjacent to Ethan's workshop. The proximity was a constant reminder of the new hierarchy. The first few weeks were excruciating. She had to sit in meetings while Ethan, her husband, sketched out bold new visions for the company. He spoke of sustainable materials, of public green spaces integrated into corporate towers, of designs that served the community as much as the client. The board members who had once been her allies now hung on his every word. They saw the Aethelred portfolio. They saw the ghost of Arthur Sterling's ambition, reborn with a conscience. They saw a genius, and they fell in line. Clara's role was to take his grand, artistic visions and turn them into actionable business plans. She had to create budgets, manage logistics, and handle the brutal realities of construction and finance. She was doing what she had always done, but now it was in service of his dream, not her own. Every spreadsheet she created, every contract she negotiated, was a tacit admission of his superiority. Ethan, for his part, was not a cruel victor. He was a demanding but fair boss. He treated her with a cool, professional respect. He listened to her input on operational matters, acknowledging her expertise in that domain. But there was no warmth, no trace of their shared past. In the office, he was Mr. Sterling, The wall between them was absolute. At home, the silence was a chasm. They lived as two ghosts in a house that was too large for them. They slept in separate rooms. They rarely ate together. The personal relationship was a ruin, and neither of them had the inclination to sift through the rubble. One evening, about a month after the will reading, Clara found him in the living room, looking at an old photograph of him and his father, standing on a construction site. "He would be proud of you," she said quietly from the doorway. Ethan didn't turn around. Yes, he would. There was no arrogance in his voice, just a simple statement of fact. "I've been reading the files for the new arts center," she said, taking a tentative step into the room. "The pro bono project. And the design is beautiful," she admitted. The word felt foreign in her mouth when applied to business. "But the budget is impossible. The materials you've specified are too expensive. It will never be approved." "It's already approved," he said, finally turning to look at her. "I'm funding the entire project myself, from the trust my father left me." Clara was stunned. "But that's millions of dollars for a project with no return." "The return," he said, his eyes boring into hers, "is a place for children in a poor neighborhood to learn how to paint. The return is a stage for a local theater group that can't afford a real venue. The return is a library where people can read. Some things, Clara, are not meant to have a financial return on investment. This is what you still don't understand." He was right. She didn't understand. Her mind was a calculator, always tallying profits and losses. He was an artist, seeing a different kind of value. For the first time, she felt a flicker, not of resentment, but of admiration. It was a small, fragile feeling, but it was there. The change in her was slow, almost imperceptible at first. She started to ask questions in meetings, not just about budgets, but about design intent. She began to read the architectural journals that were now stacked in the office lobby. She found herself defending Ethan's vision to a skeptical contractor, explaining the importance of a specific type of recycled glass, not because it was in the plan, but because she was starting to believe in it herself. Ethan noticed. He began to give her more responsibility, to trust her with more sensitive aspects of his new projects. He started to ask for her opinion, not just on operations, but occasionally on aesthetics. The wall between them, still immense, had a few bricks removed. 6 months after the will reading, they stood together on the rooftop of the newly completed Solaris Tower, his secret masterpiece. It was a company event to celebrate its official 5-year anniversary. "I never told you," she said, looking out at the sprawling city below, "but I hate this building." Ethan looked at her, surprised. "You what? Why? It's the most profitable asset we have." "I know," she said, "but it's cold. It's a monument to ego. It's beautiful, but it has no heart. It's the kind of building I would have championed." He was silent for a moment, processing her words. "It was the last project I designed before my father and I had our long talk," he said quietly. "The one where he told me the company had lost its soul. He was right. It's a perfect machine, but it's not architecture. It's just a skyscraper." In that moment, standing high above the city, a bridge was formed across the chasm between them. It was not a bridge of love, not yet, but one of mutual understanding. She finally saw the world through his eyes, and he finally saw that she was capable of change. The path to redemption is not a single, dramatic moment of apology. It is a long, arduous road of small actions, of daily choices to be better than you were. Clara had lost an empire, but in doing so, she was slowly, painfully finding her own soul. Ethan had won, but his victory was not in the acquisition of power, but in the opportunity to build a better world, and perhaps to rebuild the woman he had married. The future of Sterling Holdings was bright, but the future of Ethan and Clara Sterling was an unwritten blueprint, waiting for a new design. And that's where our story ends for today. It's a powerful reminder that true worth isn't about the position you hold or the money you have, but about the integrity you carry and the value you create in the world. It reminds us that underestimation is the greatest mistake of the arrogant, and patience is the sharpest weapon of the wise. What do you think? Did Clara deserve the second chance Ethan gave her? Or would you have simply fired her on the spot? I'd love to read your thoughts and opinions in the comments section below. Your perspective is what makes this community so special. Thank you so much for joining me for this story. If you found yourself rooting for Ethan and believe in the power of quiet strength, please give this video a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel. We have many more stories of justice, redemption, and the triumph of character coming your way. Until next time, remember to be the architect of your own life and build something beautiful.